There is a moment in every great confrontation where the room goes quiet. Not because someone shouted. Not because someone stormed out. But because something true just landed on the table, and everyone in the room knows it. This is that moment. A United States Senator from Louisiana. A folder. A pair of reading glasses. And the Attorney General of the United States sitting across from him, the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country, suddenly looking like a man who had forgotten every answer he ever knew. What happened in that hearing room didn't make the front page of every newspaper. It didn't trend for a week, but it should have. Because what Senator John Kennedy did that day wasn't political theater. It was a masterclass in accountability, the kind that doesn't come around very often in Washington, D.C. And by the time you finish watching this, you'll understand exactly why it mattered. And exactly why the people in power needed you to look away. To understand what happened in that hearing room, you first have to understand the world it happened in. Washington, D.C. runs on a very specific kind of currency. Not money, though there's plenty of that. Not votes, though those matter too. The real currency of Washington is narrative. Who controls the story? Who frames the question? Who decides what the public is allowed to care about? And for years, the Department of Justice had operated with the quiet confidence of an institution that believed it controlled its own narrative. That it could decide when to speak, what to say, and more importantly, what to never say. Merrick Garland had been confirmed as Attorney General with a reputation built over decades. Federal prosecutor. Appeals court judge. A man described by colleagues as methodical, precise, and deeply serious. He arrived at the Department of Justice carrying the weight of enormous expectations, and enormous controversy. Because the department he inherited wasn't a neutral institution operating in a political vacuum. It was an institution that half the country believed had been weaponized. That prosecutorial decisions were being made not on the cold merits of evidence and law, but on the warmer calculations of political convenience. And Garland, whether he liked it or not, was the face of that institution. He was the one who had to answer for it. The problem was, he didn't seem particularly interested in answering. Senator John Kennedy had noticed. Kennedy is not a man who is easy to categorize, and Washington has tried. They've called him a bayou eccentric, a southern caricature, a man who wraps sharp knives in folksy packaging and waits for you to grab the blade. That last one is probably closest to the truth. Kennedy holds degrees from Vanderbilt, the University of Virginia School of Law, and Magdalen College at Oxford. He clerked for a federal judge. He served as Louisiana State Treasurer for a decade. He knows exactly how institutions work, and exactly how they fail. And when Kennedy walks into a hearing room with a folder and reading glasses, he is not there to perform for the cameras. He is there to work. The distinction matters enormously, because Garland's entire strategy that day depended on the assumption that Kennedy was just another senator looking for a soundbite. That was his first mistake. And in Washington, first mistakes have a way of becoming defining ones. Picture the scene. A Senate hearing room. High ceilings. Long tables. The kind of room designed to make individuals feel small against the weight of institutional power. Garland sat at the witness table, composed, prepared, surrounded by staff and briefing books. The posture of a man who had done this before, who knew the rhythms, who understood that Senate hearings, for all their drama, were usually survivable. You answer what you can. You defer what you must. You wait for the time to run out. You go home. Kennedy sat on the dais looking down. He had his folder. He had his reading glasses. And he had something far more valuable than either of those things. He had patience. Now here's what most people don't understand about Senator Kennedy's style. His Louisiana drawl is not an accident. His deliberate pace is not a limitation. His folksy turns of phrase are not the verbal equivalent of a bad toupee. They are a weapon. Because while you're chuckling at the colorful metaphor, Kennedy has already moved 3 steps closer to the question you really don't want to answer. He lulls you into comfort. He makes you feel like you're watching a regional theater production of a Senate hearing, charming, a little quirky, nothing to worry about. And then the folder opens. And the charm evaporates. And what's left is one of the sharpest legal and political minds in the United States Senate, asking you a question you cannot answer without incriminating yourself, or lying. Garland had been briefed. He knew Kennedy was coming. He was not prepared for what Kennedy actually brought. The folder contained something simple and devastating in equal measure. Not stolen documents. Not secret recordings. Not a whistleblower's sworn affidavit. Just the record. The plain, documented, publicly available record of decisions made by the Department of Justice under Merrick Garland's leadership. Cases pursued. Cases declined. Timelines accelerated. Timelines stretched. Targets prosecuted with full force. Targets handled with unusual gentleness. Side by side. Compared directly. The kind of comparison that, when you see it laid out in black and white, makes you ask one very uncomfortable question. Is this equal justice under law? Or is this something else? Kennedy was about to ask that question. Slowly, methodically, relentlessly, and Garland was about to spend the next hour of his life trying to explain why he couldn't answer it. The moment Kennedy's turn came, the temperature in the room shifted. You could feel it, that particular stillness that falls when people sense something real is about to happen. Staffers leaned in, cameras adjusted, even Garland's posture changed, almost imperceptibly, but it changed. Kennedy didn't rush. He put on his glasses. He opened the folder. He looked at the page for a moment that stretched just a little longer than comfortable. And then he looked up at Garland. Mr. Attorney General, I want to ask you about something. And I'd like a straight answer, if that's possible. Not a legal answer. Not a process answer. A straight one. That framing alone was surgical. Because Kennedy had just told Garland, and the entire watching public, that there was a difference between a legal answer and a straight one. That the Attorney General of the United States had developed a habit of giving you the former while withholding the latter. Garland straightened slightly. His face remained composed, the practiced neutrality of a federal judge who had spent decades revealing nothing from the bench. But his eyes were doing a calculation. Where is this going? Kennedy showed him. Kennedy laid out the first comparison. 2 cases, similar fact patterns, similar evidence thresholds, similar legal standards, different defendants. 1 case, pursued with the full prosecutorial force of the federal government. Resources allocated, timeline accelerated, public statements made, maximum pressure applied. The other case, reviewed, reconsidered, referred, deferred. A timeline that stretched like taffy, a quietness that stood in extraordinary contrast to the noise of the first. Kennedy didn't editorialize, he didn't call it corruption, he didn't call it a conspiracy, he didn't give it a name at all, he just put the 2 cases side by side and asked Garland to explain the difference. And here is where it gets fascinating, because Garland's answer, his actual answer, was not a defense of the decisions, it was a defense of the process that produced the decisions. He spoke about prosecutorial independence, about the career attorneys who make these calls, about the firewall between political appointees and line prosecutors, about norms, about traditions, about the way things have always been done. It was, in the technical sense, a coherent answer. It was also, in the practical sense, a complete non-answer, and Kennedy knew it. He waited for Garland to finish, he took his glasses off, he set them on the folder, and then, in that Louisiana drawl that sounds like sweet tea and smells like a trap, he said something that made the room inhale sharply. Mr. Attorney General, with all due respect, I didn't ask you how the sausage gets made, I asked you why this particular batch of sausage smells different from that one. The room cracked, even a few of Garland's own staff, caught off guard, fought back visible reactions, but Kennedy wasn't laughing, he was already back in the folder. What separated Kennedy's approach from a typical congressional grilling was this. He wasn't making a point about one decision, he was building a mosaic. 1 case might be a coincidence, 2 cases might be a pattern, 3 cases becomes a policy, and a policy, an unofficial, unspoken, never written down policy, is the most dangerous thing an institution can have, because it means the institution is operating by rules it will never admit to having. Kennedy had come with more than 2 cases. He had come with a documented trail that stretched across months and across multiple categories of decision-making inside the Department of Justice. He moved to the second comparison. This time, the subject wasn't prosecution decisions, it was the speed of those decisions. Kennedy walked Garland through a timeline, specific dates, specific actions, specific public statements made by the department, and then held it up against another timeline running in parallel. The contrast wasn't subtle. In one instance, a case with significant political visibility, involving figures whose prosecution would be welcomed in certain quarters, the department moved with what Kennedy described as the urgency of a man whose hair is on fire. In another instance, a case with equal or greater legal merit, involving figures whose prosecution would be deeply inconvenient for certain quarters. The department moved with what Kennedy described as the urgency of a glacier. Same law, same standard, same country, different speed. Garland pushed back, he pointed to the complexity of different cases, to the different evidentiary burdens, to the different jurisdictions involved, to the entirely legitimate reasons why timelines vary. He was not wrong that those reasons exist, he was not convincing that those reasons explain the gap, and Kennedy, who had anticipated every single one of those responses, had a document for each one. The exchange that followed was one of the most unusual things you will ever see in a Senate hearing room, a sitting Attorney General of the United States, repeatedly citing process and norms and institutional practice, while a senator from Louisiana quietly produced document after document that showed the process producing different outcomes depending on who the subject was. Kennedy never raised his voice. He never called Garland corrupt, he never made an accusation, he just kept asking the question, "Can you explain the difference?" And Garland kept explaining everything except the difference. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, if you believe someone needs to do this work and do it right, hit that subscribe button. This channel exists for exactly this kind of deep dive accountability journalism, no spin, no team, just the record, laid flat, and examined honestly. Now, back to the hearing room, because it was about to get significantly more uncomfortable. There is a specific kind of moment in any confrontation where the defensive strategy stops working, where the shield that was supposed to protect you starts to reveal exactly what you're protecting. Garland had spent the early portion of his time with Kennedy behind the shield of institutional process. I trust the career attorneys. The system has safeguards. I don't involve myself in individual cases, that's how it's supposed to work. All of that may have been technically accurate, but Kennedy had a problem with it, and the problem was this: if Garland was truly hands-off, truly above the fray, then who was steering the ship? And if nobody at the political level was steering the ship, then how do you explain a ship that keeps turning in the same direction? Mr. Attorney General, you're telling me you're not involved in these decisions. I take you at your word, but here's my concern. When I look at the pattern of these decisions, and it is a pattern, not a coincidence, it looks like somebody made a policy, and if that policy didn't come from you, I'd very much like to know who it came from. Garland had no clean answer. He could say the decisions were made independently by career professionals, which raised the question of why career professionals kept arriving at the same politically convenient conclusions. He could say the decisions reflected the merits of individual cases, which invited Kennedy to read the merits side by side, which Kennedy was very much prepared to do. He could say he disagreed with Kennedy's characterization, which would require him to characterize it differently, using facts, in public. On camera, he chose none of those options cleanly. He answered in the way that institutions answer when they cannot afford the truth and refuse to tell a lie. He answered around the question. Kennedy recognized it immediately, because Kennedy had been in enough rooms, courtrooms, boardrooms, legislative chambers, to know exactly what it looks like when a smart person decides that the safest answer is one that technically responds to the question without actually touching it. He had a name for it, Mr. Attorney General. My grandmother always told me, if somebody asks you what time it is, and you start explaining how a clock works, they probably don't want you to know what time it is. A pause. What time is it, sir? The room understood, Garland understood, and the watching public, anyone paying attention, understood. The Attorney General of the United States had just been caught, on camera, in the act of explaining how the clock works. Let's step back from the exchange for a moment, because what was happening in that room wasn't just about Merrick Garland's comfort level. It was about something that sits at the foundation of American democratic governance. The Department of Justice was created to be the one institution in the federal government that is genuinely, structurally, immune to political pressure, not because the people who work there are saints, not because the system is perfect, but because the framers of the American legal system understood something profound. If the law becomes a tool of political power, if who gets prosecuted and who gets protected is determined by partisan interest rather than legal merit, then the law stops being the law, it becomes a weapon, and a society where the law is a weapon wielded by whoever holds power is not a free society. It is a different kind of society entirely. Kennedy knew this. More than that, he felt it, because Kennedy is, at his core, not a partisan performer. He is a student of American institutions who has watched those institutions bend under pressures they were not designed to withstand, and what he saw in the Department of Justice, in the pattern documented in that folder, alarmed him in a way that transcended party politics. It alarmed him the way a structural engineer is alarmed when they see the foundation of a building beginning to crack. Not with panic, with the cold, precise urgency of someone who understands exactly what happens next if nobody fixes the crack. The American public tends to experience the Department of Justice as a distant abstraction, federal cases, indictments, grand juries, legal proceedings that unfold over years, reported in dense newspaper language, processed by very few people in their daily lives. But the principle of the Department of Justice touches every American life. Because it is the promise, the foundational American promise, that the law applies equally to everyone, that the power of the federal government cannot be directed at you because of who you voted for, that the protection of the federal government cannot be withheld from you because of who you donated to, equal justice, under law, not equal justice under political convenience, not equal justice when it's comfortable, equal justice, period. That was what Kennedy was defending in that room, and it was what Garland's answers were failing to protect. By the midpoint of Kennedy's time with Garland, something had shifted in the room. The early exchanges had been uncomfortable, the middle portion had become something different, it had become relentless, because Kennedy, having established the pattern, having exposed the process shield, having made the broader stakes clear, now began to push into territory that Garland genuinely could not navigate safely, specific names, specific decisions, specific dates, not abstractions, not patterns, not characterizations, facts. Kennedy moved to a particular set of decisions that had attracted significant public attention, prosecutorial choices that, on their face, appeared to treat similarly situated defendants in wildly different ways. He named names, he cited case numbers. He read specific sentences from Department of Justice public statements that, placed side by side, contradicted each other in ways that were difficult to explain on neutral grounds, and with each one, he returned to the same question: can you explain the difference, Mr. Attorney General? Garland's responses had evolved by this point. In the beginning, he had answered with process language, in the middle, he had pivoted to legal complexity language. Now, under the sustained pressure of specific facts that his process language couldn't absorb and his complexity language couldn't explain, he began to do something that Kennedy had been waiting for. He began to assert privilege, to suggest that certain decisions involved ongoing matters he couldn't discuss, certain deliberations that were protected, certain communications that fell under executive privilege or attorney-client considerations or prosecutorial confidentiality. And Kennedy, who had a law degree from the University of Virginia and another from Oxford and had been waiting for exactly this moment, leaned forward. Mr. Attorney General, I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You're telling me that the reason you can't explain these decisions to the United States Senate, to the oversight body of your department, is that they're protected. Is that right? Garland indicated that certain matters were indeed sensitive. Kennedy nodded slowly. Sir, where I come from, we have a saying, when you don't want to show somebody your cards, that usually means you don't want them to see your hand dash. A pause. What's in your hand, Mr. Attorney General? The room went very quiet. There is a dimension to this exchange that numbers and timelines cannot fully capture, and it is this: Merrick Garland is, by virtually every account, a genuinely serious and principled man. This is not a partisan observation. It is a documented one. His career on the bench was marked by careful, considered jurisprudence. His confirmation hearings, both as a circuit court judge and as Attorney General, revealed a man who thought deeply about the law, who took his responsibilities seriously, and who genuinely believed in the institutions he served. This is relevant, because it makes the exchange with Kennedy more complicated, and more important, than a simple story of a villain being exposed. Kennedy, to his credit, understood this. He wasn't there to destroy a man's reputation, he was there to challenge an institution's behavior, and that distinction, subtle but crucial, shaped the entire character of his questioning. He never made it personal, he never called Garland corrupt, he never suggested that Garland was a bad man. What he suggested, methodically, documentably, relentlessly, was that a good man, running an institution under extraordinary political pressure, had allowed that pressure to produce outcomes that looked different from what equal justice under law was supposed to look like. That is, in some ways, a more disturbing argument, because corrupt officials can be removed, but institutions that bend under pressure, quietly, incrementally, with the full participation of principled people who tell themselves they're maintaining the norms, those are far harder to fix. Kennedy made this point explicitly, in his own way. Mr. Attorney General, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a person who has been put in an impossible position and has tried to navigate it the best you can. My concern is not with you personally. My concern is that the navigation has taken us somewhere we should not be. A pause. And my deeper concern is that you may not be able to see that from where you're sitting. It was, in its own way, the most devastating thing Kennedy said all day. Not because it was an attack, because it was a diagnosis, and diagnoses, when they're accurate, are far harder to dismiss than attacks. It would be incomplete, and unfair, to present this as a one-sided demolition, Garland is not a man who sits quietly under sustained attack, he pushed back, and his pushback deserves to be examined honestly. Because understanding where it succeeded and where it failed tells us something important about the nature of this confrontation. Garland's strongest moments came when he moved from defense to offense. He challenged Kennedy's characterizations of specific cases, arguing that the factual record was more nuanced than Kennedy's comparison suggested, that the differences in treatment Kennedy was pointing to reflected genuine legal distinctions that any fair-minded prosecutor would recognize. He argued that the Department of Justice, under his leadership, had pursued difficult cases across political lines, that the record, taken as a whole, showed an institution trying to do its job under conditions of extraordinary public pressure that came from all political directions, not just one. He pointed to prosecutions and investigations that had been deeply unpopular with political allies of the administration. Cases where the department had done the difficult thing rather than the convenient thing. These were not nothing, these were real arguments, backed by real cases, made by a man who genuinely believed them. But here is where Garland's pushback ran into its fundamental limitation. Kennedy wasn't arguing about averages, he was arguing about patterns. You can be right 80% of the time and still have a pattern problem. You can pursue genuinely difficult cases across political lines and still have a pattern problem. The question Kennedy was asking wasn't whether the Department of Justice was perfect, the question was whether the imperfections clustered in a direction, whether the cases that got pursued aggressively and the cases that got handled gently weren't randomly distributed, but were distributed in a way that correlated uncomfortably with political interest, and that question, that specific, documented, pattern-based question, Garland never fully answered. He defended the average, he couldn't explain the clustering. Kennedy let him make his case, he listened, he didn't interrupt, he didn't roll his eyes, he didn't perform impatience for the cameras, he just listened, and then he went back to the folder. Mr. Attorney General, I appreciate that, I genuinely do, now let me show you something dash. And he put another document on the record. By this point in the hearing, something fundamental had been exposed. Not a scandal, in the traditional sense, not a crime, not a cover-up, not a smoking gun, something more structural and, in many ways, more troubling, the gap between process and accountability. Process is how institutions describe themselves, accountability is how institutions are measured from the outside. And what Kennedy had spent the hearing demonstrating was that the Department of Justice, like many powerful institutions under pressure, had become very good at protecting its process while becoming less transparent about its accountability. It could describe, in exquisite detail, how decisions were made. It could not explain, in any satisfying way, why similar cases produced different results. This is not unique to the Department of Justice. This is the fundamental challenge of institutional accountability in modern governance. Large, complex organizations develop internal cultures, unspoken priorities, and habitual patterns that are perfectly visible from the outside but perfectly invisible from the inside. The people inside the institution follow the process, they believe in the process, they genuinely cannot understand why the outside world looks at the outcomes and sees a problem, because from inside, the process feels neutral, from outside. When you lay the outcomes side by side, the neutrality disappears. Kennedy was speaking from the outside, Garland was defending from the inside, and the watching public sat in the unique position of being able to see both perspectives simultaneously, and judge which one reflected reality more accurately. Kennedy understood this. Mr. Attorney General, here's the thing about equal justice, it's not enough that the people inside the building believe they're applying it equally. The people outside the building have to be able to see it. That's the whole point. That's why we call it equal justice under law, not equal justice under our own assessment of our own behavior. He let that sit for a moment. Right now, sir, a lot of people outside your building can't see it, and that is a problem that your process arguments are not going to solve. Let's address something directly, because there are people, reasonable people, who will watch an exchange like this and ask a legitimate question. Is this just politics? Is Senator Kennedy doing this because he genuinely cares about the Department of Justice, or because it's politically advantageous to attack a Democratic administration's Attorney General? It's a fair question, and the honest answer is, both things can be true simultaneously. Kennedy is a politician, he operates in a political environment, his actions have political effects and political motivations. That doesn't make his questions wrong. That doesn't make the documented pattern he presented less real. And it doesn't change the fundamental constitutional reality that Senate oversight of the executive branch, including the Department of Justice, is not optional. The framers of the Constitution did not create Senate oversight as a courtesy, they created it as a check, a specific, structural mechanism for ensuring that executive branch institutions, including law enforcement, could not operate without accountability to the elected representatives of the American people. The power of the Department of Justice is extraordinary, the authority to investigate, indict, prosecute, and imprison citizens of the United States, backed by the full resources of the federal government, is power of a magnitude that demands accountability, not occasional accountability, not convenient accountability, constant accountability, and the mechanism for that accountability, uncomfortable as it may be for sitting attorneys general, is exactly what was happening in that room. Kennedy, whatever his political motivations, was doing his job. The question on the table was whether Garland was doing his. As Kennedy's time wound toward its conclusion, the exchange entered its final phase, and Kennedy, who had been methodical, patient, and relentless for the entirety of his allotted time, shifted his approach one final time. He stopped asking about specific cases, he stopped building the pattern, he asked one final question, the question beneath all the other questions, the question that the entire hour had been building toward. He looked at Garland across the witness table. He set the folder aside, he took his glasses off, and he asked, directly, quietly, without any Louisiana color or courtroom theater, the question that mattered most, Mr. Attorney General, do you believe that every American, regardless of their political affiliation, their political beliefs, or their political activities, has equal access to equal protection under the laws of the United States? Garland answered, yes. Kennedy nodded. Then help me understand why the record I've placed before this committee today looks the way it does. He picked up the folder, he held it up, just for a moment, so the cameras could see it, and then he set it back down, because sir, I want to believe you, I really do, but right now, the record and the answer are not sitting in the same room together. He closed the folder, and the American people are going to notice. When a Senate hearing ends, the formal record closes, the lights adjust, staffers gather papers, the witness table empties, the cameras pack up, but the real record, the one that matters, doesn't close when the gavel falls. It continues in the conversations that follow, in the questions that linger, in the documentation that now sits in the congressional record, permanently, attached to the name of the Attorney General of the United States. What Kennedy had accomplished in that room was not a political takedown, it was something more durable. He had created a benchmark, a documented, public, on-the-record benchmark against which the Department of Justice's future behavior would inevitably be measured. He had made it impossible to claim that the questions had never been asked, he had made it impossible to claim that the pattern had never been documented, he had made it impossible for history to say that the United States Senate had not noticed. Garland left that room as he had entered it, composed, intact, his position secure. He was not removed, he was not disgraced, he was not charged. But something had shifted. The quiet confidence of an institution that believed it controlled its own narrative had been tested, and the test had not gone as smoothly as the institution would have preferred. That matters, not because Senate hearings change the world by themselves, but because accountability, real accountability, documented accountability, is cumulative, it builds, it compounds, and it has a way, over time, of producing the transparency that polite requests never could. Step back from the specific hearing, step back from Kennedy and Garland as individuals, and look at what this exchange reveals about how power works in America, and what it takes to hold it accountable. Power, in modern government, has developed extraordinary defenses, not defenses against investigation, though those exist, defenses against comprehension. The complexity of modern government is so vast, its processes so elaborate, its bureaucratic language so dense, that most citizens, and even most journalists, cannot penetrate the surface to ask the question that actually matters. This is not a conspiracy, it is something more mundane and more dangerous. Complexity is camouflage. When an institution can explain its behavior in language so technical that accountability becomes practically impossible, the institution has effectively insulated itself from oversight. Not through corruption, but through opacity. Kennedy's contribution, in that room, on that day, was to cut through the opacity, not with classified information or insider sources, with the record, with publicly available documents, publicly stated positions, publicly documented decisions, assembled, organized, and presented in language clear enough that anyone watching could understand what they were seeing. This is what genuine oversight looks like, not partisan attacks, not political theater, work, the unglamorous, time-consuming, technically demanding work of understanding what an institution has actually done, and holding it to the standard it claims to uphold. The lesson is not that Merrick Garland is uniquely villainous, the lesson is that every powerful institution, every one, develops defenses against accountability, and the only thing that penetrates those defenses, consistently, over time, is exactly what Kennedy brought into that room: a folder, a set of reading glasses, and an absolute refusal to accept a process answer to an accountability question. Here is what we know. Senator John Kennedy walked into that hearing room with a documented record and a single question buried inside all the other questions: are you doing what you said you would do? Merrick Garland walked in with the full institutional authority of the Department of Justice and a defense built on process, precedent, and professional composure. What emerged from their exchange was not a verdict. Courts issue verdicts. What emerged was something more valuable and more lasting than a verdict. It was visibility, the pattern that had been documented and placed on the record, the questions that could no longer be claimed unasked, the gap between what the Department of Justice says it does and what the record suggests it has done, now permanently, publicly illuminated. In America, we have a tradition, imperfect, contested, often frustrating, but real, of believing that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that the answer to institutional opacity is not revolution, it is documentation, that the answer to institutional pressure is not cynicism, it is accountability. Senator Kennedy, for whatever mix of motivations brought him into that room, practiced that tradition on that day. He shone light, he asked the question, he refused to accept the non-answer, and he put it all on the record. Where it cannot be erased and cannot be denied, the Department of Justice will continue, Merrick Garland will continue, the political battles that surround them both will continue, but somewhere in the congressional record, permanent, indexed, searchable, sits a folder's worth of documentation and an exchange that asks the most American question there is: are you holding up your end of the deal? The answer, on that day, was not convincing. And the American people, who are the ultimate judges of that question, in the end, got to see it. That is what oversight looks like when it works: not perfect, not clean, not free of political motive, but real, uncomfortable, documented accountability, the kind that makes powerful people shift in their seats and reach for process language because the truth language isn't safe, is the foundation on which every free society either stands, or falls. The most dangerous thing you can do to unchecked power is not attack it, it is watch it, carefully, patiently, with a folder and a pair of reading glasses, and an absolute refusal to look away. If this kind of deep dive accountability journalism matters to you, if you believe someone has to do this work and do it right, subscribe to this channel, share this video. Because the best thing an informed citizen can do is make sure the people who need to see this actually see it. The record doesn't lie, but it does need someone willing to read it.